What's up, everybody? Welcome to The Constitutional Architect. In this episode, we discuss the only time in American history that the people ratified a constitutional amendment, and then ratified another one specifically to undo it. The 18th Amendment banned alcohol in 1919. The 21st repealed it in 1933.
I'll drink to that.
133 deaths from poisoned bootleg liquor in a single year, a federal enforcement apparatus that couldn't contain what it had unleashed, organized crime transformed from a local nuisance into a national institution, and a constitutional lesson that the founders never anticipated needing to teach, because they never imagined anyone would try to use the Constitution this way. This is one story, two amendments, one catastrophic mistake, and the admission that it was one.
This ought to be good.
Let me introduce myself real fast. I'm JP, a former Special Forces officer with 14 years of service, having deployed to 11 countries across 3 continents. One of the things that work teaches you is the difference between a problem that requires a structural solution and a problem that requires a human one. When you confuse those two categories, you don't just fail to solve the problem, you create new ones you didn't have before.
And believe me, we are going to create some of her problems.
The people who wrote the 18th Amendment were not stupid. They were not cynical. They looked at a genuine social crisis, decided the Constitution was the right instrument to solve it, and were wrong in a way that took 14 years and a staggering amount of damage to fully admit. The purpose of this channel is to give you the tools to think through these provisions for yourself. Let's get into it.
You ready?
Born ready.
Let's discuss the world that produced the 18th Amendment. To understand why Prohibition happened, you have to understand what alcohol was doing to American life in the late 1800s and early 1900s, because it was genuinely bad.
But let me just quote the late, great Colonel Sanders, who said, "I'm too drunk to taste this chicken."
The saloon was the center of working class male culture, and not in a romantic way. Men drank away wages their families needed. Domestic violence was directly and demonstrably connected to alcohol consumption. In an era before any meaningful social safety net, a drinking husband could mean a family that didn't eat. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, these were not fringe movements. They were organized, politically sophisticated, and responding to something real. There was also a public health dimension that's easy to underestimate from a modern vantage point. Alcohol was cheap, unregulated, and ubiquitous. Beer was often safer to drink than urban water supplies. Working men drank at breakfast. Productivity in industrial workplaces was directly affected.
I have a drinking problem.
The movement that built toward Prohibition was, at its core, a reform movement. The same progressive current that gave you the 17th Amendment, the income tax, and women's suffrage. It believed the instruments of government could and should be used to improve human behavior. By 1916, 23 states had already gone dry through their own legislation. The Anti-Saloon League had developed into one of the most effective political lobbying operations in American history. Single issue, relentless, willing to work with either party. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the movement got an unexpected accelerant. Grain used to brew beer was reframed as grain that could feed soldiers. German-American brewing families, Anheuser, Busch, Pabst, Schlitz, became easy political targets in a country at war with Germany. Prohibition had the wind at its back from every direction. Congress passed the 18th Amendment in December 1917. Ratification came faster than almost any amendment before it. The required 3/4 of states ratified within 13 months. It went into effect on January 17th, 1920.
Something's about to go down.
What the 18th actually said. The 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. Note what it did not prohibit: possession and consumption. Buying a drink was illegal. Drinking what you already had was not. That distinction would matter. The amendment gave Congress and states concurrent power to enforce it, an unusual structural feature, and gave Congress and the states 1 year after ratification before it took effect, which turned out to be 1 year for the alcohol industry to move product into private storage. The Volstead Act, passed in 1919, was the enforcement mechanism. It defined intoxicating liquor as anything with more than 0.5% alcohol, which included beer and wine, contrary to what many temperance advocates had actually wanted. It created a federal prohibition bureau and set out the machinery for enforcement. That machinery would prove catastrophically inadequate for what came next. What actually happened? Here's the core problem the architects of Prohibition did not solve before they amended the Constitution. They made something illegal that roughly half the country still wanted to do.
Time to be bad.
That demand did not disappear. It just went underground. And the underground economy that supplied it became one of the most consequential developments in American criminal history. The famous Al Capone Chicago operation at its peak was generating an estimated $100 million a year across all operations. Bootlegging, speakeasies, gambling, and other rackets, equivalent to well over $1 billion today. The same story played out in every major American city. Criminal organizations that had operated at the margins of urban life now had access to capital, political corruption, and violence at a scale that had no precedent. The infrastructure built during Prohibition, the money laundering networks, the relationships with corrupt law enforcement, the organizational sophistication, did not go away when Prohibition ended. It became the foundation of 20th century organized crime. Federal enforcement was outmatched from the beginning. The Prohibition Bureau was underfunded, understaffed, and spectacularly corrupt. Agents were paid poorly enough that bribes were simply part of the economics. By some estimates, in major cities like Chicago and New York, the majority of Prohibition agents were on organized crime payrolls at some point. The courts were overwhelmed. The jails couldn't hold the volume of people being arrested.
Listen, things are getting really bad down here.
There was also a public health dimension that ran directly opposite to what the amendment intended. Legal alcohol had been regulated. Bootleg alcohol was not. And then the federal government did something that still shocks people when they hear it. It knowingly continued adding poisons to industrial alcohol supplies. Aware that bootleggers were redistilling those supplies for human consumption, and aware that people were dying, they did this as an enforcement deterrent. The program wasn't designed to kill, but the government accepted the deaths as the cost of the policy and continued it anyways. Historian Deborah Blum, who's a leading scholar in this subject, estimates it may have killed as many as 10,000 people over the course of Prohibition. Drinking did decline, especially in the early years, and especially among the working class. That part of the story is real, and it gets underreported. But the costs were severe, the enforcement was never close to adequate, and the rule of law in American cities was corroding visibly. By the late 1920s, the political coalition that had passed Prohibition was fragmenting. The Great Depression finished it. When a quarter of the country was unemployed, the argument that legal alcohol would generate tax revenue and create jobs landed differently than it had in 1919.
I started drinking again. Oh.
The 21st Amendment. Franklin Roosevelt made repeal a plank of his 1932 presidential platform. He won in a landslide. The 21st Amendment was passed by Congress in February 1933 and ratified in December. It only took 10 months. The text is direct. Section 1 repeals the 18th Amendment, the only time one amendment has ever explicitly repealed another. Section 2 does something more interesting. It prohibits the transportation or importation of intoxicating liquors into any state in violation of state or local law. That language preserves state and local authority over alcohol regulation. It gave dry states the constitutional backing to stay dry even after federal prohibition ended. There's one more structural detail worth noting. Congress didn't send the 21st Amendment to state legislatures for ratification. It sent it to specially convened state conventions. That was deliberate.
This one, special.
The fear was that dry-dominated state legislatures would block repeal even after public opinion had turned decisively against Prohibition. State conventions elected specifically to vote on this question would more accurately reflect where the country stood. It was the only time in American history that ratification conventions were used, and it worked. That provision has real staying power. There are still dry counties in the United States today. The regulatory patchwork governing alcohol, different rules by state, by county, sometimes by municipality, flows directly through Section 2 of the 21st Amendment. The federal government stepped back. It handed authority over alcohol to the states in the form that is constitutionally entrenched rather than merely statutory. The constitutional lesson. Here's what the 18th and 21st Amendments, taken together, teach about the Constitution as a document. The Constitution is a framework for governance. It allocates power, protects rights, establishes process. What it is not, and what it was never designed to be, is an instrument for resolving contested social questions about how people should live.
Live your life how you want.
The founders were practical men. They understood that the Constitution, which could be amended to prohibit alcohol, could also be amended to prohibit other things too. That using the amendment process for social policy was categorically different from using it to structure government. But they also built the amendment process to be difficult on purpose. They assumed that the high threshold for ratification would itself serve as a filter, preventing amendments that didn't command genuinely broad and durable consensus. What they didn't fully anticipate was a sufficiently organized, single-issued movement operating in the right political moment with enough momentum to clear the threshold even without durable majority support for the underlying policy. The Anti-Saloon League threaded that needle. The result was a constitutional provision that commanded enough support to pass and not enough to be sustainable. The 21st Amendment is the correction mechanism working. That is actually what Article 5 is there for. Not just to add to the Constitution, but to fix it. The repeal of the 18th is the one clean example in American history of the constitutional system recognizing mistake and formally undoing it. It required a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress and ratification by 3/4 of the states. The same threshold that made the 18th Amendment difficult to pass made the 21st Amendment difficult to pass. And still it happened in 10 months. That's what we're sitting with. The system was designed to make the constitutional change hard, not impossible. When something was wrong enough for long enough with clear enough consequences, the mechanism worked. And those are the Prohibition Amendments. The 18th and 21st Amendments are the only pair in American history where one was written to erase the other. They are a 14-year experiment in using the Constitution as a lever for social transformation. And the verdict, delivered constitutionally, was that it didn't work. Now the lesson isn't that moral reform is wrong. The lesson is that the Constitution is the wrong instrument for it. Policy can be changed by legislation. Legislation can be revised, repealed, or adjusted. Constitutional amendments are supposed to be harder to undo. And when you put something in the Constitution that turns out to be a mistake, The only remedy is the most difficult process in American law. They used that process, and fortunately it worked. That's actually the hopeful part. Next episode,
Let's go, girls.
the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, the 72-year campaign from Seneca Falls in 1848 to ratification in 1920, the organizing, the arrests, the hunger strikes, the political maneuvering, and the one-vote margin in Tennessee legislature that put it over the top. The amendment the Constitution needed, and the movement that finally forced it through. If this episode gave you something to think about, like, share, follow, and please go subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you then.